Somebody reached out to me recently and they told me that they were rebuilding the motorcycle. I don't know if they wrecked it, but they had a wrecked Indian Springfield. And it has the same engine in this bike, which is a 2022 Indian Chief, Super Chief. 116 Indian ThunderStroke, Indian players, however you want to describe it. They've been making this engine since 2014. So 116, 1900cc engine. And he asked me if I had a spare crankcase lying around. So what a crankcase is, that is essentially the engine block. You got two halves, left and a right. And I told him no, I didn't have one. Because crankcase, if you buy one brand new from Indian, it's $3,000. And I was like, yeah, I don't have a $3,000 case just sitting around. And Indian won't let you buy one side of it. You have to buy both sides. And I guess it makes sense because they want to make sure that like it mates correctly. And sometimes you have to get bearings to fit the crankshaft a certain way. So they have to be, measured and cut to be put in there. So you want it to be right because you don't want things kind of like not, because the tolerances are so thin, you don't want them to not fit, right? So his issue was that his engine, when that bike was in a wreck, the engine mounts, two of the engine mounts were pretty much almost sheared off, but the shape of it was still there. And being that this was cast aluminum, it was just like brittle. Like if you ever seen cast aluminum, it's one of the hardest metals to weld on. But I told him rather than buy a new crankcase, see if you can find a welder, a TIG welder, that will weld you and fabricate something there to make it work. So he did that. And I'm actually kind of jealous because this person that he found, I think he paid like $100, gave it to him on a Wednesday, and on a Thursday he got it back. Well, when I tell you, they made that look almost stock. The only thing he didn't do was paint it. So everything fit, lined up exactly how it was supposed to, and he put that engine back together. Well, when he put it back together, I did not know how he put it back together. And that's why I say I cannot help you put your engine back together, unless I see how it was put together. So the beautiful thing about the ThunderStrokes is that I put it on a level 1 to 10 or I guess 1 to 5 of ease for like a new beginner to put it together. I would probably put it on there like difficult level. I'd say about a 3. It's not bad at all. And the reason for that is because a lot of this engine is just huge assemblies, like camshaft, the crankshaft, the transmission, the oil pump, all of it is just assemblies. So when you take stuff out, it come out as one huge unit unless you're changing something out individually on those units. But it's a very reliable engine. And this was my very first engine that I rebuilt. And one of the videos, my top video of all time on this channel is the one where I rebuilt one from ground up pretty much. So the problem that he was having is that the engine would not turn over. So he put it back together and everything, and his starter would make this hissing noise. So this is something I had never heard of before. The first thing I thought was, maybe the torque limiters, the starter's not grabbing the torque limiter to turn the gears, to turn the crankshaft, to turn the engine over. Something's not turning. So we went from grounding issues to checking the individual starter to checking the timing. And he ended up buying a new starter and kind of find out it was not the starter. And I was like, dude, I wish you had told me before because you could have got one off eBay used for half the price and it was the same part as one of the other bikes. Because luckily Indian uses a lot of these same parts on the other bikes as other companies do. But he wanted a brand new starter because he wanted to make sure that the starter wasn't the problem. But that was $450 going down the drain because the starter was perfectly fine. So at this point, we're just throwing shit at a wall pretty much to see if it sticks. And he took the cover off, the cam cover, to check the timing because I was like, well, maybe the timing may be off because again, at this point, I don't know how he put the engine together. So one thing I was asking him to do was take the inner cam cover off because if it's starter related, you need to check, because we knew it was starter related. Like it wasn't even attempting to turn over anything. It wasn't like, I didn't know if the torque limiter had been like, if it was slipping or if the reduction gear was not put on correctly. Because the majority of this engine, things pretty much go one way, right? It has to go in one way. But there are a few things that you can put on incorrectly because the majority of this engine is pretty much gears versus like some of the Harley engines, there's more chains and stuff. There's only one chain in this entire motor or engine, and that's on the timing chain. So there's not much room for error, but there's still a few ways that you can mess some stuff up. So I basically told him at one point, I was like, dude, I don't know if I can help because I can't see what you did to put this thing together. So I'm just throwing stuff at a wall. So he eventually takes the inner cam cover off, and I kind of understand why he didn't want to take that off, because that's a lot of work. So what we have here, you got the rear cylinder, the front cylinder, and behind this little cover are the cams, but this is the inner cam cover. And you got the starter right there from the front, okay? So to get to that, you have to take off the foot peg assembly, whether it be floorboards. Exhaust has to come off. Front cylinder, rear cylinder, ignition assembly, rear push rod tubes, front push rod tubes, and the lifters that are in here. Because when you take the cams out, if you don't have the special tool to keep the lifters from dropping, these little lifters in here that push the push rods up, that open and close the valves, that makes the bike go vroom vroom, those lifters drop into the bottom end of the engine, and you're gonna have an entirely separate issue. All of that just to get these screws out to get this inner cam cover off to see what we needed to see for the starter assembly. For us regular people, that's a lot of work. That's easily a day of work. And this whole dialogue went over the course of like a week and a half. So he finally does take it off. And he starts showing me pictures of like the different gears. So there's one specific thing I wanted him to look at, but it involved taking the, I think it's called the Sprag clutch gear off. And when he took that off, he said, "This looks right, right?" And I said, "No, that is not right." So there's something in pretty much the majority of every automotive engine, especially bikes. There's something called a one-way clutch. And it's called a one-way clutch for a reason, because there's these little, I guess, camshaft shaped pieces that are in a circle, and they're under compression. And what happens is when they receive power, it allows the gear to turn one way, but it won't allow it to turn the opposite way. So basically it applies power in one direction, which turns, so when the starter hits, it pops out, turns everything, it applies force to that clutch, and it turns the crankshaft. And once the crankshaft turns, it turns everything, and gas hits, boom, spark, it keeps it going, and the starter pops back in, so I've done my job. The problem is he had it in backwards, so it wasn't able to apply the force to the crankshaft in the right direction. So it wasn't working. So he takes it out, he tries to put it in, he hits me back and said, "Dude, is this supposed to go in like this? It's really hard to try to put this in." I said, "Yeah, that's how it's supposed to go." So he finally puts it in, and I think after like maybe 2 days, he gets the engine back together and it fires up. He sends me a video of it running, and you know, I was like, I'm glad I could help, but I was just thinking internally, I was like, this is why you have to see how somebody did something. And that's why it's so hard for mechanics and machine shops to try to like work through issues if they didn't do the work themselves. And that's why you have to diagnose things step by step, because you don't know what you're getting into until you start digging into it. And me, I'm just a random guy. I was like, yeah, try this or try that. And luckily we were able to figure out what the issue is. But it reminds me a lot of when I took my engine case to have it welded. I thought like, oh yeah, I just called them over the phone. Can y'all, well, what I asked them was, do you guys do welding, this machine shop? And they said, yeah. So rather than tell them what I had to take it to them and say, this is what I need done. And they're like, oh yeah, we can do that. And I had to explain like, you know, this is the function of this thing, so they knew exactly what to do. And also when I had to have a wheel spacer made, I had a wheel that had 2 rotors on it, but the bike only required 1. So when I put that wheel on the bike, there would have been an extra slot there. So I had them also make a spacer for me to kind of like block it off, but I had to take the wheel to them and say, right here, this is what I need done. So the long story short to this is that technicians, mechanics, anybody, and include myself, I'm still learning. There's always room to learn, but I was glad that I was able to help. But we have to see it. And I can't help you fix your engine if I don't see it. I can't help you through any of your problems if I can't physically see it. I can kind of point you in the right direction, but I'm still going off of what you're telling me, right? So he was able to get the engine started, and I think he's still working through a few little knickknacks right now. But it was not to pick on him. I just think it was a really good story. But it just shows even when things seem simple, well, a lot of times I guess they are simple, but it's almost like he went through a rite of passage, because when I was rebuilding my engine, I broke 2 piston jets, which means I had to tear down the engine all the way down to nothing to fix it, because the way that the piston jet is, it sits in between the engine case, and the screw is recessed where it's impossible to get to without taking the engine completely apart. And I made that mistake twice, including putting the transmission together wrong. So this was his rite of passage, and I guarantee you he will not make this mistake again. I made that same mistake twice, because the first time I broke it and then realized until I put it back together. Then the second time I broke it while I was focusing on fixing the transmission, right? So it's a lesson learned, and I think a lot of us can learn something from that. So let me know what y'all think about that down below. I'm glad he was able to get his engine fixed and he didn't have to buy a $3,000 crankcase, but I don't think he's gonna make that mistake again. So that's it. Let me know what y'all think. Catch you in the next one. Peace.